Letters from home. The Zippo made its small metallic click in the dark, a sound so familiar that Thomas no longer needed to look at it to know exactly how the lid would feel against his thumb, how the wheel would catch, how the flame would bloom and tremble for a second before steadying itself. On one side of the lighter, worn by years of handling and damp air, were the words Dayton, Ohio, 1952. He could have traced them with his eyes closed. There were certain objects a man memorized because he loved them, and others because he feared what might happen to him if he ever stopped remembering where they had come from. He cupped the flame against the evening air and lit a cigarette, more for the ritual than for the smoke. In Vietnam, every small ritual mattered. It gave shape to hours that otherwise dissolved into heat, waiting, and unease. The camp still steamed from the afternoon rain. Water dripped from the eaves of the barracks in slow intervals. The ground was too wet to be called earth and too solid to be called mud, and boots sank into it with a tired, sucking sound that seemed to belong to the place itself. Humidity sat on his skin like an extra layer of clothing. Nothing ever truly dried in that country. Not uniforms, not canvas, not paper, not thoughts. Even fear seemed to absorb moisture and grow heavier with it. Thomas sat on an empty crate outside the hoche and looked toward the line of trees beyond the camp. At that hour the jungle had begun its slow conversion into darkness. During the day it was green, difficult, overgrown, and oppressively alive. By evening it became something else entirely. It withdrew its details and kept only its shape. It gathered itself. It seemed less like landscape than presence. The men in camp rarely said that aloud, but they all felt it in one form or another. Night in Vietnam was not simply the absence of daylight. It was a condition. It thickened around them and pressed against the perimeter, as if the world beyond the lamps had its own breath, its own patience, its own intentions. He smoked and tried not to think about how quickly such things had begun to feel normal. That frightened him more than the obvious dangers did. The first patrol had frightened him because it was new. The first night of gunfire had frightened him because it cracked the last of his illusions cleanly enough that even memory could not mend them. But what truly unsettled him now was the quieter transformation taking place inside him. He had begun, in small and terrible ways, to adapt. He no longer flinched at every distant burst of noise. He no longer found the smell of wet canvas and oil strange. He no longer expected sleep to arrive kindly. The body was willing to learn almost anything if it had to. The soul was slower, but not always wiser. Sometimes it learned the wrong lessons simply because they were the most available. From the radio shack nearby came the faint electrical hum of a set that still needed attention. Thomas could hear when a contact was bad almost the way another man could hear a note sung off key. It was his business to notice such things. Signal Corps' work had made him intimate with static, wiring, and the stubborn mechanics of distance. He spent his days coaxing voices through damaged equipment, repairing broken lines and helping messages travel farther than metal and weather had any right to allow. Orders, coordinates, weather reports, warnings, requests, fragments of ordinary procedure wrapped in the false simplicity of military language, all of it passed through machines that seemed forever on the edge of failure. He often thought there was something cruelly fitting in that. Men kept asking wires and batteries to hold together a world that did not want to remain intact. He should have gone back to the shack and fixed the contact properly. Instead, he stayed on the crate and let the cigarette burn between his fingers. Fatigue ran through him too deeply for movement to seem worth the trouble. It was not the fatigue of a long day, but of prolonged alertness, the kind that settled in muscle, behind the eyes, in the base of the neck, and made a man feel as though even rest had become another task he could not quite complete. Then, from somewhere near the center of camp, the evening shifted. Mail call always did that. It moved through the camp faster than official orders, and more powerfully than any speech. Men who had spent all day moving with dull mechanical efficiency came back to life in an instant. It was never graceful. A card game stalled mid-hand. Someone rose too quickly from a bunk. Someone else tried to maintain an attitude of indifference and failed before the effort was halfway complete. Hope became visible all at once, though most of the men seemed ashamed of it, even as they surrendered to it. War taught men to hide need, but letters from home cut through that training every time. Thomas stood and walked toward the cluster forming under the hanging lamp where the mail was being handed out. The air smelled of wet earth, sweat, and tobacco. Names were called, envelopes passed from hand to hand. Some men received 2 or 3 and became suddenly careful, as if their hands had forgotten how to hold anything so fragile. Others received nothing and took the emptiness harder than they allowed their faces to show. There was always a particular look in the men who came away empty-handed, a studied casualness that convinced no one, least of all themselves. When Thomas received 3 letters at once, he felt something tighten in his chest with such force that for a moment the camp around him thinned at the edges. The lamp, the men, the mud, the trees beyond the wire, all of it seemed to recede while the envelopes in his hands came into almost painful clarity. He knew each sender before reading the names. His mother's letter had the most careful handwriting, neat and upright, every line measured, every space deliberate, as though the page itself were something that ought to be treated with respect. Sarah's handwriting tilted and ran, full of energy, the loops larger than necessary, the lines occasionally climbing upward, as if her thoughts had outrun the paper's ability to contain them. Mary Jane's hand was the quietest and the most unmistakable. There was a softness to it that never slipped into prettiness. It carried restraint, as if each word had been placed rather than merely written. 3 letters. They weighed almost nothing, and yet the weight of them felt immense. He carried them back to the crate outside the hotch, and sat for a long moment without opening any of them. There was a tenderness in delay that people unfamiliar with separation might not understand. Before a letter was opened, everything within it remained suspended. The world back home was still intact in the exact proportions in which memory held it. No illness had yet been mentioned. No small grief had yet been named. No shift in tone had yet announced that time had been moving elsewhere without him. An unopened letter still contained possibility in its purest form. It allowed him for one more minute to imagine that the people he loved remained exactly as he had left them. The sky over camp had turned a washed-out violet. Somewhere nearby, a radio produced a blurred trace of music and static, faint enough that he could not tell whether he was truly hearing a trumpet or merely remembering one. He looked at the envelopes again, feeling the texture of paper soft by travel and damp air, and began with his mother's. The first thing that reached him was not the content, but the sensation of home carried through the page. Paper had a smell. He had learned that in the field the way he had learned the smell of oil, river water, mildew, canvas, and dust. His mother's letter smelled dry in a way that almost hurt him. It carried traces of a cleaner world, kitchen cupboards, flour, soap, wooden drawers, the faint domestic stillness of a house that had existed long before his absence and would continue painfully to exist during it. Her writing was steady, as it always was. She began by telling him the family was well, though he knew her well enough to understand that whenever she wrote those words, she had likely gone through a private inventory of possible dangers before allowing herself to put them on paper. She mentioned his father's work at the factory and the way autumn had begun to turn in Ohio, described the changing weather, the pace of church life, the kinds of details that would have seemed small to anyone else, and therefore meant everything to him. She wrote about neighbors who had asked after him, about Sunday dinner, about the ordinary movement of the week. There was apple pie one afternoon after service. There was tiredness in her own body that she did not name directly, but that he could read between the lines, because mothers who insisted others not worry about them were often the ones carrying the most unseen weight. She mentioned in a way almost casual, and therefore all the more piercing, that Mary Jane had come by to help peel apples on Sunday. The sentence brought the kitchen back with such vividness that Thomas had to lower the page for a moment. Memory did not return to him in grand cinematic sweeps. It came by way of furniture, light, and repeated gestures. He could see the sink under the window. He could see the steam collecting on the glass in winter. He could see the blue mixing bowl with the chipped rim his mother never threw away. He could see his father at the table, shoulders broad, face tired from work, speaking little but missing nothing. He could see Sarah turning conversation into weather of her own. He could see Mary Jane at the counter, sleeves rolled, laughing softly at something his mother had said, while pretending not to notice him watching her. Before Vietnam, such scenes had belonged to the category of ordinary life. Distance had changed their value. It had not made them perfect. It had made them sacred. His mother's letter turned, as he half knew it would, toward the spiritual center from which she had always lived. She reminded him to keep the small Bible she had given him. She did not push religion on him in the heavy-handed way some women in church did. She wrote instead with the plain, unadorned certainty of a person who believed prayer was as practical a resource as bread or clean water. She urged him to eat when he could, rest when he was able, and guard something inward that she understood better than he did himself. She was not asking him only to stay alive. She was asking him to remain morally recognizable to himself. That more than physical danger was what she feared the war might take. Thomas sat with the letter in his hand and felt its quiet force settle into him. His mother had never been sentimental. She did not dramatize suffering. She did not make speeches. She simply knew, with the ruthless intuition mothers possess, that violence offered men an endless education in hardness, and that hardness could become a habit before a man even realized he had accepted it. He folded the letter carefully and rested it on his knee. Sarah's came next. The pages immediately released a different sort of energy. If his mother's letters were a well-kept room, Sarah's were a front porch in summer when too many people were talking at once, and no one minded. Her thoughts arrived rapidly and without hierarchy. School, church, local scandal, weather, dresses, a civics test, the absurdity of adulthood, the indignities of chores, the behavior of neighbors, the cruelty of ugly hats, the quality of candy, the latest small drama among people she knew and judged with the confidence only a 17-year-old sister could possess. It was all there in a flow so lively that he could almost hear her moving from one subject to the next before he had finished reading the one before it. The beauty of Sarah's letter lay in its refusal to understand its own importance. She wrote as if the details of home were trivial, which meant she wrote them honestly. There was no performance in her language, no attempt to elevate daily life into something larger than itself. She simply handed him the town one scrap at a time. A dog had bitten the postman again. Someone at church had purchased an unforgivably ridiculous hat. A girl from school had declared herself in love with an obviously unworthy boy. The train station still smelled like coal and rain. A television had appeared in one neighbor's house, and according to Sarah's account, had already begun to alter the family's moral structure. Each detail was so small that it would have been laughable in any other setting. There, in that camp at the edge of the jungle, they became precious beyond measurement. He smiled while reading in a way he had not realized he still could. Sarah did not know what she was doing when she wrote to him like that. She thought she was merely filling pages. What she was actually doing was proving that a world still existed in which people cared about hats, trains, peppermint candy, and local foolishness. She was preserving scale. War had a way of convincing men that only large matters counted. Strategy, danger, death, national will, sacrifice, survival. Letters from younger sisters restored perspective by insisting that the world also still contained bakery mishaps, bad manners, dances, sore feet, and weather discussed too seriously over supper. Yet even in Sarah's buoyant pages longing slipped through. Near the end of the letter, her energy softened. She admitted, not in a dramatic way, but in the shy, sideways honesty of someone trying not to burden the person she missed, that certain sounds made her turn instinctively toward the door. A truck passing at night, a step outside, the ordinary noises of return. For a second, before thought corrected her, she would imagine he was home. The pain of that was not that she grieved publicly. It was that grief had entered her reflexes. The body hoped faster than reason could intervene. That undid him more than any formal declaration of missing him might have done. He folded Sarah's pages with a care that would have amused her and set them on top of his mother's letter. Then he picked up the third envelope, Mary Jane's. He looked at her handwriting for a long time before opening it. Something in him feared the intensity of her presence on paper because it reached him too directly. If his mother steadied him and Sarah restored the texture of home, Mary Jane had the power to reopen parts of him he was using all his energy to keep functional. When he unfolded her letter, a ticket stub slipped out into his lap. An Ohio theater matinee. The object itself was insignificant, a thin scrap of paper most people would have discarded without thought. In Thomas's hands it became one of the most intimate things he had touched in months. It had been in her purse or her pocket. It had passed through a Saturday or Sunday in Dayton. It had lived, however briefly, in the same weather she lived in. The fact that she had chosen to send it told him something essential about the kind of longing she carried. She was not trying to impress him with eloquence. She was trying to send proof of contact with a shared world. Her letter began plainly, with the kind of honesty she often reserved for paper, because paper allowed her to think before revealing herself. She admitted she had struggled to know how to begin, which was itself a beginning he recognized as hers. She had gone to the picture show with Sarah. She had thought of him more than was practical. She had found herself unwilling to throw away the ticket, because lately everything connected to ordinary life seemed too meaningful to discard casually. There was wit in her letter, but it was subdued by tenderness. She mentioned gently his bad coffee habits. She mentioned the small personal details lovers memorize without deciding to, the way he tapped his fingers when thinking, the way he pretended not to like dances while remembering every tune, the particular fatigue that changed his voice at the end of a long day. Nothing she described was grand. That was what made the effect devastating. She was not loving some ideal version of him preserved in heroism. She was loving the exact person he had been in the ordinary world, down to habits he would have thought too minor to notice. She wrote of the train station at dusk, of steam moving under the lamps, of moments in town that seemed arranged around his absence, a seat in a diner, a hardware store window he used to mock, a hymn sung slightly late because he always came in a half-beat behind. She was discovering as he was that love mapped itself onto physical places. Once someone had been woven deeply enough into a town, absence became architectural. It lived in corners, benches, sidewalks, windows, routines. A whole landscape could hold the outline of one missing person. What struck him most, though, was the moral urgency beneath her tenderness. She did not tell him merely to come home alive. In her quieter, steadier way, she was asking for something far more difficult. She wanted him to come back with some essential inward claim still intact. She understood, perhaps as clearly as his mother did, that a body could return while the self had been thinned, darkened, or estranged beyond easy repair. What she longed for was not only his survival, but the survival of whatever in him still belonged to his deepest nature. He lowered the letter and looked out into camp, though he was no longer really seeing it. A lantern swung from a beam and sent light moving in slow arcs across wet ground. Men drifted back toward the barracks with letters folded into breast pockets or lying open in their hands. Some were smiling to themselves with embarrassment. Some looked older than they had an hour before. Some who had received no mail had gone quiet in the disciplined way loneliness sometimes taught men to go quiet. The jungle beyond the camp stayed dark and unreadable. Thomas placed all 3 letters in front of him on his knees and became suddenly aware of the split life he was living. One part of him remained there in Vietnam, damp and underfed on sleep, accustomed to mud, rifles, field radios, watches in the dark, and the continual low-grade readiness for alarm. Another part, no less real for being physically absent, still moved through Dayton. It walked past the depot. It sat at the kitchen table. It lingered near church doors after Sunday service. It stood under autumn trees and watched light leave the neighborhood street by street. He was beginning to understand that war did not merely remove a man from home. It forced him to inhabit 2 worlds at once, and fully belong to neither. That was one of its quietest injuries. The men who spoke most confidently about war tended to speak in abstractions: duty, strategy, ideology, sacrifice, victory, loss. Those words were not false exactly, but they were incomplete. They failed to account for the strange suspension of self that separation produced. They did not explain what it felt like to hold 3 letters and realize that the people writing them existed in a world that continued to move without you. They did not explain the almost physical pain of being remembered in detail from far away. They did not explain how the heart could remain divided between a place of danger and a place of love until both began to ache inside the same chest. He reached into his pocket and touched the small Bible his mother had given him. He took out his wallet and opened it. Mary Jane's photograph was still there, soft at the corners from use and humidity. Beside it was an old clipping Sarah had once mailed him from the Dayton paper, a grainy winter photograph of the depot under snow. The image was poor, but he treasured it with the irrational intensity distance gave to objects. The depot in that clipping had become more than a building. It was evidence that the town still existed in stable weather, under orderly skies, where snow fell instead of monsoon rain and men could stand on platforms without scanning tree lines. Nearby, the radio in another hut found a clearer signal for a moment. A trumpet line rose, fragile through static. It sounded like Louis Armstrong, though Thomas could not be certain. He chose to believe it was. The sound reached him like a voice from a gentler country, one in which emotion could still move through music openly, without being forced into military usefulness. He thought then of his father. Frank Miller had likely not written more than a line or 2 in any of the family letters, if that. Verbal economy was the man's native climate. He loved by presence, by constancy, by practical acts too modest to announce themselves. His own war had ended long before Thomas was born, and yet it had remained in the architecture of his habits. a dislike of enclosed underground spaces, a sensitivity to sudden noise, a way of sitting in restaurants that always chose the wall behind him. Silence had become his method of carrying what he could not set down. As a child, Thomas had mistaken that silence for iron. Only later had he understood that it was also, in places, old damage organized into discipline. That made thoughts of his father both painful and clarifying. If Thomas came home altered, Frank would see it before anyone else did. Not because he would be looking to find it, but because one damaged man knew the outlines of another. The recognition of that possibility unsettled him. He sat a while longer with the letters spread before him and watched the camp settle toward night. One by one the casual noises thinned. A man scraped mud from his boots. Another coughed in the barracks. Somewhere a prayer was being said under a breath too low to make out. The generator hummed. Insects worried the lamps. A child's laugh drifted from some village outside the camp perimeter and disappeared almost at once, leaving behind the strange ache that unexpected innocence always caused in places built around fear. At last Thomas took out the notebook he kept wrapped in oilcloth. He had begun writing in it almost without planning to. At first it had been practical, a place for dates, impressions, bits of weather, technical frustrations, small records against the eroding pressure of repetition. Over time it had become something closer to witness. He wrote most often as if writing to Sarah, perhaps because she was young enough that he wished to protect her and honest enough that pretending felt impossible. Writing to her allowed him to stand somewhere between confession and concealment. He could tell the truth without describing every terror in full. He uncapped his pen and stared for a long while at the page. Then he began. He wrote that mail had come through after the rain, and that for a brief period every man in camp had remembered there was once a world built of porches, kitchens, ordinary weather, and names spoken with affection rather than rank. He wrote that men in uniform handled envelopes with a reverence they never showed toward anything issued by the army. He wrote that the quickest way to understand soldiers was not to study them in battle, but to watch their hands during mail call. He described, gently, the transformation that took place when paper from home crossed an ocean and arrived in a muddy camp. Faces changed, shoulders changed, silence changed. For a few minutes, each man seemed to step back into civilian proportion, as if remembered love could restore his former dimensions. He wanted, as he wrote, to tell Sarah the whole truth. He wanted to explain what waiting did to the nerves, what darkness did to thought, how the first crack of distant gunfire could alter the chemistry of a man's body before his mind had time to catch up. He wanted to tell her that courage did not feel noble from the inside. It felt embarrassed, improvised, and closely tied that other men were standing beside you. He wanted to tell her how easy it was to begin adapting to the unacceptable. But 17-year-old girls, however clever, were not meant to bear the full inventory of war's psychological weather. So he wrote in a register she could survive. He told her that his fellow soldiers had immediately become interested in Ohio the moment pie was mentioned. He told her the radios mostly behaved when the weather felt charitable. He told her that now and then a breeze moved through camp in a way that almost resembled one from home. He told her enough truth to keep faith with himself, but not so much that he would drag the jungle into the family kitchen by way of ink. Then he turned the page and began another unsent letter in his mind, one addressed to Mary Jane, though he was not sure he would ever actually post it. The thoughts came slower and cost more. He found himself writing that words from home did reach him, and that their power lay precisely in how thoroughly they crossed distance. He found himself admitting that there were describable parts of his days: heat, machinery, mud, insects, bad coffee, exhausted jokes, and indescribable parts, too, especially the prolonged condition of waiting that made every sound too significant and every silence seem inhabited. He found himself putting down in a sentence so plain it startled him that he worried less now about dying than about becoming accustomed to what should never become familiar. When he reread that line, he did not cross it out. Something in him recognized it as the cleanest truth he had written since arriving in country. He set the pen down and leaned back, tired almost beyond feeling. The night had deepened. Above the dark line of the trees, a thin moon had risen. Men were climbing into bunks. The last cigarettes were being smoked to the filter. The faint ghost of music on the radio had dissolved again into static. The camp did not sleep so much as lower itself into a more fragile kind of consciousness, every man aware, whether he admitted it or not, that rest in such places was always provisional. Thomas gathered the letters again. He folded his mother's first because her orderliness deserved order, Sarah's next because her pages resisted neat folding and had to be gently persuaded, Mary Jane's last, with the theater ticket tucked back inside. Then he slid all three into the breast pocket of his shirt, directly over his heart. The gesture would once have embarrassed him for its obviousness. In that moment it felt simply accurate. 3 letters and a ticket stub. That was all. Then paper, a few pages of ink, one small object that had passed through a Saturday in Ohio. None of it could shorten the war, cool the air, quiet the jungle, or guarantee his return. None of it could solve anything a commander might have called strategic. Yet the force of those things on his interior life was beyond calculation. They reminded him that he had not originated in danger. He had come from rooms with curtains, from meals eaten at regular hours, from trains arriving under lamplight, from family fatigue and neighborhood absurdity, and a woman who remembered the way he tapped his fingers when thinking. The letters restored specificity to a self that military life and fear were always trying to reduce. That restoration was not sentimental. It was necessary. Men in war needed many things: food, sleep, functioning equipment, dry socks, luck, competent leadership, if they could get it. But beyond the obvious, they needed evidence that tenderness still existed somewhere, and that it still knew their names. Without that, hardness came too easily and began to call itself realism. A man could survive on hardness for a time. He could not remain fully human on it forever. Before going inside, Thomas rose and walked to the radio shack. He opened the set that had been bothering him and adjusted the contact properly. The buzz settled into something cleaner. Voices moved in and out of range, clipped official traffic, requests, reports, pieces of a war translated into electrical pulses. He listened only long enough to be sure the connection held. Then, almost without deciding to, he tuned slowly along the band until he found music again. It came faint and worn by distance, but it came. Trumpet, voice, static, the whole fragile machinery of longing reaching through weather and geography. He stood there listening and thought of Dayton not as a fantasy of innocence, but as a place made real by particular things. Factory whistles, autumn light on narrow streets, the smell of coffee at the diner, coal smoke in winter, church bells on Sunday, his mother's apron, his father's hands, Sarah's restless humor, Mary Jane near the station lamps with her coat collar turned up against the chill. Home did not become more valuable because it was perfect. It became more valuable because, at a distance, every ordinary detail revealed the depth of one's attachment to it. When he finally climbed into his bunk, the wood above him smelled damp and old. Someone farther down the row had already begun to snore. Another man turned restlessly in sleep. A mosquito whined near his ear and vanished. Outside, the jungle remained patient and unreadable. Tomorrow would bring the same heat, the same work, the same strained relationship between routine and danger. The war would still be there when morning came, unresolved and indifferent. But that night, with the letters resting over his heart, Thomas possessed proof of another world. Not an invented one. Not a polished memory made false by distance. A real world in which his mother still worried and disciplined silence. His father still converted fear into practical questions. Sarah still filled pages with the unruly comedy of being young, and Mary Jane still kept scraps of ordinary life, because throwing them away felt like a betrayal of shared time. A world in which his absence was felt not as abstraction, but as an empty place at a table, a missing figure under station lamps, a shape the town itself had learned to keep for him. Lying there in the dark, Thomas understood something he had not been able to articulate before. Letters from home did not erase war. They did not even interrupt it for very long. What they did was far subtler, and in some ways more profound. They reminded a man that he was still more than the conditions surrounding him, more than mud, rank, fear, fatigue, and survival, more than the worst thing he had seen or the worst thing he might yet do. Somewhere across an ocean he was still held inside other people's memories as son, brother, beloved. And as long as that remained true, some essential line inside him had not yet been broken. He slipped one hand over his breast pocket and felt the edges of the folded paper through the fabric. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere far off without bringing rain. The generator hummed steadily. Night insects continued their endless work. The camp breathed. The jungle waited. The world remained dangerous, humid, half-legible. Yet sleep came to him more gently than it had in weeks. The last thing he carried with him before drifting under was not the darkness at the edge of camp, not the lingering memory of gunfire, not the mechanical noise of the radios, but the layered presence of home, a kitchen in Ohio after Sunday supper, a depot at dusk under steam and yellow lamps, a father pretending practicality was not grief, a sister too young to know she was preserving his sanity, and a woman who loved him enough to fear not only for his life but for his soul. He slept with those images in him and the letters over his heart, and for one night at least the jungle was not the strongest thing in his mind. It was home.